Fast and Furious was never just a movie franchise. It was a promise: speed, risk, asphalt, engines screaming louder than the dialogue. And somewhere along the way that promise quietly disappeared. And Fast 11 might be the first movie that forces us to admit it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Fast and Furious stopped being about racing a long time ago. But it kept pretending it wasn't. And that lie is now the biggest problem the franchise has. In the early films, racing was not decoration. It was the language of the story. Characters proved who they were behind the wheel. Not through speeches or explosions. Speed was identity. Danger was earned. And winning actually cost something. By the time we reach Fast 11, racing is no longer the point. It's a reference, a memory, sometimes a cameo, sometimes a nostalgia shot designed to remind us of what this used to be. And the franchise knows it. Fast 11 is not being built around races. It's being built around legacy, family, consequences, and spectacle that has nothing to do with cars anymore. The action is bigger. The stakes are louder. The physics are optional. But speed, real speed, is missing. And that absence creates a strange emptiness. Because without racing, Fast and Furious becomes just another action franchise. And there are already too many of those. This is where the problem gets deeper. Because racing was never just an activity. It was the excuse. It justified why these characters mattered, why the world bent around them, why their skills felt grounded. Once you remove that foundation, everything becomes myth instead of motion. Dom is no longer a driver who became a legend. He is a legend who sometimes drives, and that shift changes everything. Fast 11 seems aware of this loss. But instead of fixing it, it might be choosing to move past it. And that choice is risky, because fans don't just miss the races. They miss what racing represented. Personal stakes, limitations, vulnerability, the idea that one wrong move could end everything. Modern fast movies replace that with invincibility, and invincibility kills tension faster than any villain. This also explains why bringing Brian back matters so much. Not because of nostalgia, but because Brian represents the last era where driving still meant something, where winning wasn't guaranteed, and survival wasn't scripted. If Fast 11 truly wants closure, it has to confront the fact that it abandoned the very thing that made this world believable in the first place. But here's the twist. What if Fast 11 isn't trying to go back to racing at all? What if it's admitting that the franchise has outgrown its roots? And instead of pretending otherwise, it's preparing to end the story without them. That would explain the tone shift, the focus on legacy, and the feeling that this isn't a celebration, but goodbye. And that leads to the real question, not whether Fast 11 can bring racing back, but whether Fast and Furious can survive without it. Because once speed is gone, what's left isn't a racing saga anymore. It's a myth about family, power, and survival. And myths don't need engines to move forward, but fans do. So the real test of Fast 11 isn't how big the action is, or who returns. It's whether the franchise remembers what made us fall in love with it, or whether it's finally ready to admit that the finish line was crossed a long time ago, and we just didn't notice. Fast 11 keeps pretending that racing is still part of its DNA, but the truth is much darker than that. Because racing in this franchise was never about speed, it was about choice. Early Fast movies used races as moments where characters revealed who they really were under pressure. Every race forced Dom to decide between winning and family, between ego and loyalty, between escape and responsibility. And that's why those scenes mattered, not because of nitro or engines, but because the road was where consequences existed. Fast 11 quietly removes that space, and when racing disappears, something else disappears with it. The ability for characters to prove themselves without violence. Now every conflict is solved with explosions, armies, and global stakes. And that sounds bigger, but it's actually smaller, because when everything is a war, nothing feels personal anymore. Racing used to be the last honest language this franchise had, a place where characters couldn't hide behind teams or technology, just skill, fear, and instinct. This is why Fast 11 feels strange even before anything bad happens, because the movie isn't building tension, it's stacking spectacle. There's no question of who Dom is when the engine starts, because the engine never really starts anymore. And that creates a dangerous problem for the story. Because Dom Toretto without racing is just another action hero. But Dom Toretto choosing to race was something else entirely. It was a man confronting who he is when no one forces him to fight. The franchise knows this, which is why it keeps circling back to street imagery. old locations, familiar sounds, but never fully committing. It wants the emotion of racing without the vulnerability of it. Fast 11 hints at this conflict constantly, through dialogue about legacy, through callbacks that feel almost guilty, like the film knows what at last, but isn't ready to admit it out loud. And this is where things get really uncomfortable. Because if Fast 11 isn't about racing anymore, then what is it really about? Control, not speed, not freedom. Control. Every set piece is designed, calculated, supported by teams, satellites, backup plans. Nothing is spontaneous. Nothing is risky in the way racing once was. Which means Dom isn't risking himself anymore. He's managing chaos instead of facing it. That's why bringing Brian back, even symbolically, matters more than people think. Brian represents the last version of this world where a race could still change everything. Not save the planet, not stop a war, just change a life. And when you remove that scale, you remove the soul of the franchise. Fast 11 stands at a crossroads it refuses to acknowledge. Either it finds a way to make racing meaningful again, not as nostalgia, but as narrative truth, or it fully accepts that Fast and Furious is no longer about the road, but about surviving its own legend. And that's a choice the movie hasn't made yet. The most dangerous part isn't that Fast 11 abandoned racing, it's that it still pretends it hasn't. And as long as that lie exists, the franchise can't move forward, only louder, bigger, and emptier. And that leaves one final question hanging. Not answered, not even asked directly, but impossible to ignore. If Fast and Furious was born on the street, and it no longer lives there, then what happens when the road finally stops calling Dom back? Because when the road goes quiet, legends don't crash, they fade. And this is where Fast 11 quietly becomes the most dangerous movie in the entire franchise, because it stops pretending that racing is the point. The cars are still there, the engines are louder than ever, but the reason to drive is gone, and that's not an accident. Dom is no longer chasing freedom, revenge, or family. He's being tested, watched, measured, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Fast 11 keeps pulling away from the road on purpose. No iconic street races. No clean finish lines. Every chase feels interrupted, unfinished, almost frustrating. And that frustration is the message. Because when a saga built on motion starts slowing itself down, it means something is about to break. And the film keeps dropping clues that Dom isn't losing control. He's being cornered into a choice he's been avoiding since the first movie. Here's the part that changes everything. If Fast 11 isn't about racing anymore, then it's not about winning either. It's about whether Dom can exist without the road. And that's the one question the franchise has never asked. Because if he steps away, the legend dies quietly. But if he races again, it proves something terrifying. That he was never free. That the road owned him the entire time. And the movie refuses to answer that question. No final race. No clear victory. Just Dom standing still while the world moves around him, daring him to choose. Fast 11 doesn't end with speed. It ends with tension. Because the real ending isn't about what happens next. It's about what Dom decides not to do. And that's why Fast 11 isn't the end of the saga. It's the moment the saga turns and asks its most uncomfortable question yet. If the race no longer matters, what happens to the man who was built by it?